Hey, I'm Madonna here from New Leaf Natural Therapies, and I just wanted to have a chat with David Sheil again today. So, family counsellor, trauma and grief expert. So, let's just have a chat. So, what's been on your mind lately that is so important for people to understand
Well,
at the moment?
firstly, is that we've just been through 4 years of pandemic, and it's become obvious through the studies that people are really either quite stressed or still affected. Even now, though we've picked up a lot of the pieces, there's still people that I see have anxiety and depression from the outcomes of not only the decisions that people made, but also about the way it was managed, because we ended up in a situation where we had a medicine that had a lot of side effects, and a lot of people are still affected from those. And the other thing is that the effect of being locked down, and so one people made one choice and may have got some type of injury. Now it's been found that there's all a very broad spectrum of different health problems from the medication itself. But also on that side, a lot of people didn't do it voluntarily. They did it because of a mandate, and they did it just to keep their jobs. And it wasn't really genuine decisions that was with informed consent. And the other side is that
No, it was coercion.
yes, but the other side also is that a lot of people who didn't do it got really bad, quite badly persecuted socially, and also as far as work's concerned. So they weren't able to get employment for maybe 2 or 3 years, and in those sort of circumstances, and it's also the studies have come out and showed a lot of polarization, not only in social groups, but also family groups. We see around us a lot of families split in half because of these things. And because it's only a temporary thing, it wasn't like went on for years, like 10 years, like complex trauma in childhood. There's still, even though it's short term, it should be easier to work on to get back to normal, because it was
Right.
only a temporary thing, and people were changed temporarily and not acting the way they normally did on either side of the decision that was made.
Yeah.
And because of that, you'd call that in like psychology, like, or medicine, an adjustment disorder.
Right.
That is, it's situational, and it's not something that people have permanently, because they were actually distressed only because of the situation, and because of the fear, and because of often the arguing that happened amongst people. And so with counselling, there's a whole range of things we can do with supportive counselling. A lot of people just need to be heard, because part of healing any type of trauma is to be listened with empathy, because often we haven't had that ear during the pandemic because people were polarized.
Yeah.
They were forced on one side, and so people weren't listening empathetically. So the thing counsellors do is they'll listen to your story empathetically, and that'll have a therapeutic effect. So that's one thing I've been on my mind. And because of that being on my mind, it's there's a type of trauma called betrayal trauma, where people they feel betrayed by that they were forced to make a decision. And so there's a lot of information on that. You can look it up online if you want to look at the guide. Look up Tim Fletcher betrayal trauma, and you'll get a whole video on it, and it'll show you that even though it's usually a part of complex trauma in childhood, it also has an institutional element to it, so that you can, like, for example, if you're told you're getting a medication and they don't tell you the side effects, you might feel it then. Anyway, but it's worth watching Tim Fletcher video on betrayal trauma just to work through it and see. Because another thing about trauma, loss, and grief is that everybody's affected differently. So within a family group, in a very traumatic family group, some people are fine and some people are devastated for their whole life within the same family system, because everybody reacts differently depending on the age they are and depending on their level of resilience and all types of stuff. So with counselling, we can help build resilience. We can help listen empathetically, so that, because a lot of people just need to be heard and need a little bit of encouragement. And so with that in mind, another thing that I deal with is complex trauma. So this comes out of recent studies in the last 20 years. They've worked out this thing called adverse childhood experiences, and they call them ACE scores. You can look it up online. There's an ACE questionnaire, ACE questionnaire, and you can look up to see how many points you get. They're combinations of abuse, neglect, if your parents divorce or something. Anyway, there's a whole range of scores they worked out. And if we can resolve these, we can actually have a much better life, because they happened when we were children, when we were too little. And the idea isn't to blame your parents. The idea is to resolve them. Because what happens is that a series of adaptions come about, and adaptions are, so an example is, if I feel a lot of shame in my childhood because of what's happening in my family, for instance, they can become adaptions like perfectionism. We have to do everything perfectly because that's how we adapt as a kid. Or if we approach,
and that's how we don't get smacked or we don't get in trouble, if we're perfectionists.
Right. And
so we do whatever protects our ego.
Mm-hmm. And this relates into attachment. We want to get secure attachment. And even though it happened the adaptions we made in our childhood become maladaptions in adulthood. So even though they worked as a kid, like, for example, if you've got an indifferent caregiver, someone who's a bit neglectful, you might go for them to be comforted by something, and they'll tell you to get over it or just be ignored. So we've approached authentically, and that didn't work. So maybe we'll be manipulative or inauthentic, to get our needs met. Yeah. And so those adaptions, they worked in our childhood, and they worked, to cover our shame or this sort of thing, but they've never been resolved. And it's actually really quite easy to resolve them just by identifying them. And these days, what's happening is people have got the ACE score and they fill it out and they go, my parents were narcissists. Well, that's not true. Most of the time, everyone's doing their best. In some extreme cases, there are perpetrators, right, who are actually hurt their children. But in a lot of cases, most people are just managing, and a lot of these things can be resolved. But the important message is, if we were harmed as children and we've got an ACE score of 4 and above, we've got to be careful, because we could potentially harm others just because of our childhood adaptions. And so the quicker we resolve them, the quicker we can have smooth working families where we can live a more beautiful life with less conflict, less stress. And by, like all healing says, by removing stress, things can heal naturally.
More celebration, more joy, more living life.
And more celebration, more joy, more living life.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave.